Why are some countries rich while others remain poor? Is it because of natural resources? But then, if that were the case, how can Venezuela, sitting atop the world's largest oil reserves, be still drowning in misery? Or what about Brazil, the second largest producer of iron ore and the biggest exporter of soybeans? Why is Brazil still poor? The answer to this question, why do nations succeed, is not in the soil or geography. The truth lies in the fabric of each country's institutions. And to see this in action, let's head to Nogales, on the US border. But before we get there, you need to understand that there are two worlds out there, one made of extractive institutions and another one made of inclusive ones. In countries with extractive institutions, power is highly concentrated in the hands of few. It's a system designed to keep the powerful always on top, and only a small group benefits at the expense of many. The taxes people pay, well, they don't see a dime. It all funnels up to the elites through corruption. On the other hand, inclusive institutions distribute power more equally, allowing for broad participation in both politics and the economy. This opens the gate for innovation, investment, and prosperity. And in few places in the world, the difference between these two types of institutional realities is more evident than in Nogales. Two separate cities, one single name, two different countries. Nogales, Arizona, US to the north, Nogales, Sonora, Mexico to the south. In Nogales, Arizona, kids go to school, adults have completed their education, and many residents are over 65 years old. People have access to healthcare, electricity, sewage system, and the internet, which are considered basic things and which are taken for granted. But most importantly, they have law and order. People in Nogales, Arizona live safely without being worried about getting robbed or killed. They also operate under the assumption that, despite its inefficiencies and occasional corruption, the government is their agent. Democracy is like a second skin to the population, and people can vote to replace the mayor and other representatives. They have a say, they can choose who will be in power. Thus, representatives not willing to be taken down by the people need to show service. A few meters south of the fence, though, life is completely different. In Nogales, Mexico, incomes are a third of what they are up north. Many haven't finished school, and life expectancy is significantly lower. Crime is high, the roads are a mess, corruption is everywhere, and starting a business is like dancing with the devil. After all, there are lots of permits to get and lots of bribes to pay. In Nogales, Mexico, life is a struggle, and just surviving can feel like winning. The law, instead of protecting and empowering the population, serves the few at the top. Now, what explains the huge contrast between these two cities separated by nothing more than a barbed fence? It cannot be the climate, the geography, or diseases, as microbes can easily cross the border. What defines the differences is the border itself. On one side, Americans benefit from American institutions, while on the other, Mexicans are governed by Mexican institutions. And the incentives created by each one of these are completely different. And this is hugely important because, in the end, the success of a society is shaped by the incentives that drive it. As Warren Buffett says, "Show me the incentive and I will show you the outcome." People will be productive if they have a reason to be, if they get rewarded for their efforts, if they can keep for themselves the results of their work. And in Mexico and much of Latin America, the social incentives are completely upside down. In this region, playing by the rules hardly gets you anywhere, and climbing up has meant for centuries exploiting your neighbor. And I speak this from personal experience. You see, I live in Brazil, and we say, here's where the lamppost pees on the dog, to communicate exactly this, that the social rules are all backwards. Those who do the right thing often end up bad, while those who act wrongly tend to prosper. Here, the elites are made of state bureaucrats who align themselves with key private sector players. Their goal? To extract as much as possible from public resources. After all, the law is a joke, and no matter how much public funds you misappropriate, you probably won't get arrested. And even if you do, you likely won't be behind bars for long. That's why we say here everything ends in pizza. Taxes are high, the market is underdeveloped, and wages are low, especially in the private sector, and most people dream of working in the public sector, where the real benefits and high salaries really are, where the keys to the treasure lie. After all, the state never lacks money, as it can always raise taxes, thus taking more resources from the population. So, instead of focusing on producing value, the truth is that these countries find themselves more busy with extracting wealth from each other. It's no surprise Latin American countries have lagged behind and remain impoverished. After all, who would risk their money in such places, right? The problem is that if people don't feel safe enough to invest in your country, this means fewer businesses are created and thus less jobs. And of course, this has very serious social consequences, because yet people still need to eat. And when they can't make ends meet in an honest and legal way, a path most prefer under normal and favorable conditions, well, they will find other ways. If the only option available is to take from others, well, you can bet that's what people will do, right? And so the country falls into a socio-economic vicious cycle from which is pretty hard to get out. Now, in the US and other developed countries, things are a little bit different. But before we dive into that, please don't forget to leave your like and to subscribe. Your support helps me a lot to continue making these videos. Now, in the US, the story is different. While Latin American institutions were shaped by Spanish and Portuguese colonization, focused on social control and extraction, the United States was founded under the principles of democracy, rule of law, individual freedom, and property rights. And we will soon talk about this. First, what you need to understand is that the American historical process resulted in a completely different environment for businesses and investments. Social incentives are much more aligned with progress. You see, in free economies, making money is not about extracting your neighbor's resources. No, in an open market, you earn by solving someone else's problem with the product or service that you are offering. As economic exchanges happen by free will, people will only buy from you if you add value to their lives. And with free competition, you must offer the best possible service or product at the best possible price, otherwise competition takes your place. And though super challenging, this is what drives the constant development and improvement we see every day. It's no surprise that free and decentralized economies are much healthier places for economic and social progress. After all, instead of concentrating on taking from each other, people in these economies are busy solving each other's problems in order to make a lot of money. In the US and other developed nations, the rule of law also prevails. And if law and order exist, stability emerges and the seeds for the future can be planted. If private property rights, for example, are respected, this means capital has less chance of being seized, which of course attracts more investors. And if people start investing in your country, this means access to capital becomes cheaper, more opportunities arise, more jobs are created, fewer people need to turn to crime, and that's how a country enters into a virtuous economic and social cycle. So in summary, the border that divides Nogales, Mexico and Nogales, United States illustrates that what determines a country's success isn't climate or geography, but rather the incentives created by each country's institutions, by the jurisdiction. If a nation incentivizes extraction, well, not much value will come out of there. However, if a country encourages production, letting people get rich and protecting private property, you can bet people will compete fiercely to offer the best at the lowest price, which ultimately benefits the population and brings progress. Now, how did these places end up so differently? The answer lies in the history of these countries. You see, while the United States was colonized by the British, Latin America was mainly colonized by the Spanish and Portuguese, and this made all the difference. England, despite emerging as one of the greatest naval powers in the world in recent centuries, entered the maritime colonization race much later. This race had been initiated by Portugal and Spain, who quickly claimed the most desirable territories in the south, such as the Caribbean and South America. These regions were prized for their favorable climate, but most importantly for the abundant gold and large populations that could be enslaved. The Spanish colonization strategy, initially refined by Cortés in Mexico, proved extremely effective and consisted of overcoming resistance by capturing the indigenous leader, which allowed the Spanish to seize his wealth and force his people into submission. The next step for the Spanish was to establish themselves as the new ruling elite within the indigenous society, assuming control over existing methods of taxation and, above all, forced labor. Following the brutal conquest of the Aztecs in 1521, Hernán Cortés, now the governor of the province of New Spain, began to distribute the indigenous people like property through the encomienda system. Under this system, the natives were handed over to Spaniards known as encomenderos, to whom they were obligated to provide labor and tributes. In return, the encomenderos, the Spaniards, were supposed to convert the natives to Christianity. The Spanish expropriated the indigenous land, imposed heavy taxes, and charged exorbitant prices for products whose purchase was not even voluntary. And the aim of these measures was to squeeze the natives dry, reducing their living standards to subsistence levels, while directing all surplus revenue to the Spanish crown. And although these measures generated immense wealth for Spain, they also turned Latin America into the most unequal continent in the world, and undermined much of its economic potential. And it was with this legacy that Latin America's institutions developed themselves. Extractive from birth. Surprised it's still functioning the same way? The colonization of North America, though, was quite different. You see, England, a latecomer in the maritime colonization race, didn't choose North America for its attractiveness, but because it was what was left on the table. Now, before we continue, if you are enjoying this video, check out the book Why Nations Fail, which I used to build this video and whose link I left in the description below. A great reading that changed completely the way I see the world. The English planned to conquer North America using the same ruthless playbook as the Spanish, capturing the local chief and using him to obtain provisions and force the population to work for them. The notion that settlers would work and cultivate their own resources never crossed their minds. This was not how the conquerors of the New World operated, right? After all, they were there to take, not to work. However, the operation was a failure. First, the natives near Jamestown were not sitting on piles of gold like their Central American cousins. Secondly, the English failed to enslave the natives or to establish lasting trade relations with them. As a result, the natives imposed a blockade on Jamestown, aiming to starve everyone to the bone. John Smith was one of the first to realize that what the Portuguese and Spanish had done in Latin America wouldn't work in Virginia. Smith realized that for this company to stand a chance, it was the settlers who would have to do all the heavy work. Therefore, he requested the company directors to send him the right kind of people. He no longer wanted useless goldsmiths, but rather farmers, carpenters, fishermen, and anyone else who can dig trees and roots. Jamestown would survive by its own labor. But still, the Virginia Company, which managed the Jamestown enterprise, insisted on doing things the old way, at least until the Big Famine arrived, killing 2/3 of the colony. Desperation got so bad that the settlers even resorted to cannibalism. It became evident that a new system was needed in Jamestown, so Sir Thomas Dale introduced a draconian regime for the settlers, though not for the elite who manage it. This included severe penalties, such as the death sentence for anyone trying to run away from the colony seeking refuge with the natives, or for anyone selling any commodities outside the colony. The new idea became, if you can't enslave the natives, then chain up the settlers, right? But the problem is that under this hard labor regime, slipping away from the colony to join the natives started to look real tempting, and equally appealing was the prospect of fleeing beyond the Virginia Company's reach and striking out on one's own, especially since the region was not densely populated. When enslaving neither the natives nor the settlers was feasible, a new approach, a new system became necessary. The only remaining alternative was to offer incentives to the settlers. Thus, a land grant system was introduced, awarding each male settler 50 acres of land with an additional 50 acres for each family member and servant they brought to Virginia. In 1619, a General Assembly was established, allowing settlers to be represented and have a say in their own government. This planted the first seed of democracy, which would bear fruit 150 years later with the Revolution of 1776. There were still attempts to impose draconian regimes and enslave settlers, but the New World offered various alternatives and options. So if a harsh regime was enforced in one area, people would simply flee to another one, causing the original colony to lose its labor force. Meanwhile, the places they fled to would develop faster, benefiting from the influx of settlers. Therefore, offering incentives to the settlers became essential to ensure their work, and soon settlers began demanding more economic freedom and broader political rights. In Maryland, for example, settlers insisted on owning their own land, forcing Lord Baltimore to establish an assembly. To attract the necessary influx of immigrants, Maryland also passed the Toleration Act, granting religious freedom. In 1691, this assembly induced the king to declare Maryland a royal colony, thereby stripping Lord Baltimore and his lords of their political privileges. Something similar happened in South Carolina, where the aristocrats lost once again, when the region became a royal colony in 1729. By the 1720s, all 13 colonies that would become the USA had similar government structures. There was a governor and an assembly representing landowners. They were not democracies. Women, slaves, and the landless were denied the vote. Nevertheless, political rights were quite extensive compared to contemporary societies elsewhere. So now, after considering the formation process of both regions, Latin America and the US, it becomes clear why the US is more advanced politically, economically, and socially. Latin America formed itself around an extractive system. In North America, however, the inability to establish a society by enslaving first the natives and then the settlers led the English to create a new type of society, offering incentives and freedom to cultivate the land. Does this mean that the formation of the US was free of slavery, or that its process was smooth and peaceful? Not at all, right? However, for that time, it represented a much more liberal society when compared to those in Latin America. The thing is that this difference in the colonization process created different types of institutions that generated extremely different kinds of incentives, which over time produced extremely contrasting results. So why do nations succeed and why do nations fail? It's because they either effectively establish institutions that encourage people to work, innovate, and invest, or they don't. In the end, that's it. If a nation cannot incentivize production, in the long run, it is finished. Well, that's it for today. See you next time.